In the spring of 1944, the Japanese oil tanker Taiyo Maru was somewhere in the South China Sea when the torpedo struck her below the waterline. She went down in under 12 minutes. There was no distress signal that reached shore. There was no rescue. The tanker had been carrying approximately 10,000 tons of crude oil north from the refineries of Sumatra toward the home islands of Japan. Every barrel of that oil went to the bottom with her. She was one of more than 40 tankers the United States Navy's submarine force would send to the ocean floor in that single year. The men who planned and executed that campaign understood something about the nature of modern naval war that the Japanese Imperial Navy, for all its tactical brilliance at Pearl Harbor and Midway, had never fully reckoned with. A fleet that cannot fuel its ships cannot move those ships. A navy that cannot move has already lost. Japan had entered the war in December 1941 with a fundamental geographic problem that its war planners had chosen to solve through conquest rather than reckoning. The home islands of Japan possessed almost no petroleum. The refineries and oil fields that could sustain a modern war economy lay thousands of miles to the south, in the Dutch East Indies, in Borneo, and Sumatra. The entire strategic logic of Japan's southern advance in 1941 and 1942, the seizures of Malaya and the Philippines and the Dutch colonial islands, rested on the assumption that Japan could establish a maritime supply corridor and hold it. Raw crude oil from Palembang and Balikpapan would flow north by tanker to the refineries at Singapore and the processing facilities near the home islands. From there, it would flow outward to the fleet. The plan required a merchant marine capable of protecting and sustaining that flow under wartime conditions. Japan entered the war with roughly 6 million tons of merchant shipping. Its planners calculated they needed at least 5 million tons of that to remain functional. What they had not adequately calculated was the American submarine. The United States Navy's submarine force in December 1941 was not yet the weapon it would become. American submarines carried a torpedo called the Mark 14. That had been developed through the 1930s at a cost the Bureau of Ordnance considered substantial, which arrived at the Pacific War with two defects that were, taken together, nearly catastrophic. The Mark 14 ran deeper than its set depth by as much as 11 feet. That meant that shots aimed at a tanker's waterline passed harmlessly beneath the keel. The contact exploder in the warhead, the mechanism that detonated the weapon when it struck a steel hull, had never been tested against an actual steel hull at actual combat speeds. And it failed. It failed because the firing pin was too heavy, and the detonating mechanism crushed itself on impact rather than firing. American submarine commanders in the first year of the war reported attack after attack in which their torpedoes ran true, struck the target and produced nothing. A dull thud, a clang, nothing more. The failure was documented in patrol report after patrol report. Commander Dudley Morton of the USS Wahoo filed reports describing attacks on Japanese shipping in which multiple hits produced no explosions. Commander Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang described the same experience in terms that were, even within the formal language of official naval correspondence, barely restrained. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington resisted these conclusions for more than 18 months, arguing that the fault lay with the submarine commanders rather than the weapon. It was not until September 1943 when Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of submarine forces in the Pacific, conducted live firing tests against a cliff face on the island of Kahoolawe and demonstrated the exploder failure mechanically and unambiguously, that the Navy finally authorized a replacement. The corrected Mark 18 electric torpedo and the modified Mark 14 with a new exploder began reaching fleet submarines in the final months of 1943. What happened next is one of the most concentrated episodes of maritime destruction in the history of naval warfare. In the calendar year 1944, American submarines sank 603 Japanese ships totaling approximately 2.7 million tons of merchant shipping. That figure represented more than 45% of everything Japan's merchant marine had possessed at the beginning of the war. The tanker losses within that total were disproportionately severe. Of the roughly 863,000 tons of tanker capacity that Japan had operated at the start of hostilities, American submarines had destroyed so much by mid-1944 that the volume of oil actually reaching the home islands had fallen to less than a third of the minimum the Navy required to sustain normal fleet operations. The numbers were precise and they were brutal. Japan refined and moved approximately 1.75 million barrels of oil per month through its tanker network in early 1942. By late 1944, that figure had collapsed to somewhere below 360,000 barrels. The fleet was not being strangled slowly, it was being strangled fast. The men doing the strangling operated under conditions that the popular history of the Pacific War rarely conveys with sufficient specificity. A fleet submarine of the Gato or Balao class carried a crew of approximately 70 officers and enlisted men in a pressure hull roughly 311 feet long and 27 feet in diameter. The interior temperature in tropical waters without the engines running could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The atmosphere was contaminated by diesel fumes, battery gas, the accumulated biological output of 70 men living without bathing facilities for patrols that routinely lasted 45 to 60 days. The food was good by the standards of the wartime Navy. This was because the submarine service had decided early that feeding its crews well was among the few comforts it could provide. But the psychological pressure of operating a vessel that could not outrun a destroyer on the surface and could not outrun a depth charge pattern at any speed produced a category of stress that no training program could fully simulate in advance. The commanders of these boats were almost uniformly young by the standards of command in any other branch of the service. Dudley Morton was 36 when he took command of the Wahoo. Eugene Fluckey was 28 when he first went to sea as a submarine officer, and 31 when he took command of the USS Barb, the boat that would eventually earn him the Medal of Honor. Samuel Dealey of the USS Harder was 39. These men developed tactics that were not in the pre-war doctrine. Morton pioneered the concept of the night surface attack, in which a submarine approached a convoy on the surface in darkness, where it had a speed advantage over the slow-moving tankers, fired multiple torpedoes in rapid succession at close range before diving. The tactic was aggressive to the point that several officers who served under Morton used the word reckless, then immediately corrected themselves by pointing out that it worked. What it worked against was a convoy escort system that Japan had been catastrophically slow to develop. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with an institutional orientation toward offensive fleet action. Destroyers were weapons of attack, tools for torpedo runs and fleet screening, not instruments of convoy protection. The notion that a significant portion of Japan's destroyer force should be diverted to escort duty for merchant tankers struck the naval leadership in Tokyo as a misallocation of fighting power. Grand Escort Command, the organization within the Japanese Navy responsible for convoy protection, was not formally established until November 1943, more than 2 years into the war, by which point American submarines had already destroyed enough tonnage to permanently impair Japan's ability to replace what was lost. Japan completed approximately 600,000 tons of new tanker construction during the entire war. American submarines sank tankers faster than that construction rate for 3 consecutive years. The geographic dimensions of the campaign are essential to understanding why the numbers accumulated so rapidly. The sea lanes connecting the Japanese home islands to the Dutch East Indies ran south through the East China Sea, through the straits between the Philippine Islands, then down into the Celebes Sea and the Java Sea. Those straits were narrow enough in places that a submarine positioned correctly could wait for traffic the way a toll collector waits for traffic on a bridge. The Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Formosa became so dangerous for Japanese shipping by 1944 that fleet planners began referring to it internally as the most hazardous stretch of water in the Pacific. American submarine commanders called it among themselves the doorstep. They operated there in coordinated groups of 3 boats, a tactic called Wolfpack operations adapted from German practice in the Atlantic. In the months between June and October 1944, they sank enough tanker tonnage in that region alone to account for a measurable fraction of Japan's total annual oil imports. The most direct operational consequence of the tanker losses struck the Imperial Japanese Navy in June 1944. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the carrier task forces assembled by Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo for that engagement were not short of aircraft. They were not short of trained aviators in the numbers available in mid-1944. They were short of the aviation fuel that the pilots needed to execute the attack profiles the battle plan required. Several Japanese carriers arrived at the battle with fuel loads that their commanding officers knew were insufficient for full air operations. This was because the tankers that should have supplied them had not arrived. The tankers that had not arrived because they were at the bottom of the Pacific. The battle that followed, that Rican naval aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed more than 300 Japanese aircraft and 3 carriers and effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct large-scale carrier aviation for the remainder of the war. The fuel shortage did not cause that outcome alone, but the fuel shortage was present at every level of Ozawa's operational planning in a way that shaped the options available to him before the first aircraft left a flight deck. By October 1944, the situation had deteriorated far enough that Admiral Toyoda Soemu, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, made a decision that had no real precedent in the previous 3 years of Japanese naval operations. He ordered the fleet to sortie for the Battle of Leyte Gulf with fuel reserves that his own staff calculated as insufficient for a return voyage to home waters if the operation did not achieve its objectives quickly. The fuel to send the fleet south to the Philippines existed. The fuel to bring it home did not exist in adequate quantity. The tankers that would have carried that fuel had been sunk. Toyota understood this. He ordered the sortie anyway, on the reasoning that a fleet which could not be fueled was not a fleet at all. That using what remained in a decisive engagement offered better odds than preserving it for a battle that could never be fought. The 4-day engagement that followed was the largest naval battle in history by the number of ships involved and resulted in the loss of 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The men at the center of the American submarine campaign operated largely without the public recognition that fighter pilots and infantry commanders accumulated during the same years. Submarine operations were classified at a level that prevented contemporary press coverage of specific patrols or specific commanders. The patrol reports that documented the sinkings were sealed. The tonnage figures did not appear in newspapers. Richard O'Kane's crew on the USS Tang sank 33 ships totaling approximately 116.000 tons, before a malfunctioning torpedo circled back and sank the Tang itself in October 1944, killing all but 9 of the crew. O'Kane survived as a prisoner of war and received the Medal of Honor after the war ended. Eugene Fluckey's Barb bombarded Japanese shore installations with rockets and landed a sabotage party on the Japanese home island of Hokkaido, the only ground combat operation conducted on Japanese soil by American forces during the entire war. Fluckey received the Medal of Honor as well. The cumulative accounting of the submarine campaign was compiled after the surrender from captured Japanese records and cross-referenced against American patrol reports in a process that took analysts at the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee more than a year to complete. The final figures credited American submarines with 1,314 Japanese vessels totaling 5.3 million tons of shipping, representing approximately 55% of all Japanese shipping losses from all causes during the war. Of that total, tankers accounted for a disproportionate share of the strategic impact because each tanker sunk did not simply represent a lost vessel, but a permanent reduction in Japan's ability to transfer the petroleum that everything else in its war economy depended upon. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese Navy's operational fuel reserves had fallen so low that several of the fleet's capital ships were sitting at anchor at their home bases with no practical prospect of putting to sea under their own power again. The submarine force had achieved this result with 288 boats that conducted patrols at various points during the war, losing 52 submarines to all causes. The loss rate of approximately 18% was the highest of any branch of the United States Armed Forces. The men who served in those boats knew the loss rate. They knew it before they sailed.